and it betokens tremendous problems and disorder later on, at least I hope not by virtue of things. So welcome to Policy Exchange for this effective relaunch of our energy security unit, and we couldn't have two better people to do this. We've got a newly minted Secretary of State, whom we're privileged to have as one of our alumni, a senior fellow and former member of our Indo-Pacific Commission, in Right Honourable Claire Coutinho MP, and of course the world's greatest authority on energy security, Dr. Daniel Yergin, who will curse me for an excess of praise, but nonetheless I happen to think it's true in the light of all of you who know his great Pulitzer Prize-winning work called The Prize, and then his latest work here, The New Map on Energy, Climate and Nations. We've got copies on sale at the back, kindly supplied by Penguin, so please go to the very back there. You'll find it, if you haven't read it yet, well worth the read. I also ought to state, just on grounds of incentivising you, that we're also honoured to have Dr. Yergin's consort, spouse, Professor Angela Stent, one of the world's leading, greatest authorities on Russia, author of this other great work, Putin's World, which she's going to be talking about Russia during the Ukraine conflict tomorrow. We like to incentivise you properly, so this wonderful work will also be available tomorrow, but it will be entirely free of charge, since so pro bono books for all if you come along to her address tomorrow at 1 o'clock. So please join me in welcoming all our guests here today. Just counterintuitively to ask Dr. Yergin, who's Victor Ludorum for distance travel, to come over here for this thing. It's a very new ministry with the title of Energy Security, and then Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, and before coming on to Secretary of State, it's an interesting combination, and critics, cynics might say that the two dimensions of that title are in apparent tension with one another. I know the title piqued your curiosity as one of the, in the light of your years of analysis of energy policy all across the world. I'd just be grateful for your thoughts, Dan.
Well, certainly, just out of curiosity, we don't have to hold these mics.
No, you're booming.
Okay. Good.
Everyone can hear you.
Well, thank you
and
very
soon
much.
The whole world will be
thank you, Dean, for the invitation to be here, and very pleased to be with the Secretary of State and to have the opportunity to discuss this. And when we were talking about it, I said, I don't think there is any other ministry in the world that's called the Ministry of Energy Security and Net Zero, and at least to my sense, that really reflects the reality that's quite different from, say, 2021, when there were scenarios about how easy it was to do energy transition. And it reflects the fact that that ambition for net zero also needs to exist with energy security and meeting the needs of energy security. Otherwise, you get things like votes that you get in Germany or the Netherlands and so forth. So, at least to me, it's a brilliantly named and unique ministry. You don't know any other ministry of that title, do you?
I haven't come across an international counterpart that has the title, and it was a political choice that was made, because the energy department here used to sit in a broader department to do with business and industrial strategy. But after everything that we've seen for the last couple of years, what you can feel in the international space is that energy security has massively gone up the agenda. So when I talk to my counterparts, whatever their title may be, we talk a lot about energy security now. And I think from our perspective, having a department which was purely focused on that and looking at the energy transition made a huge amount of sense, because you need that level of ministerial focus if you consider the scale of the challenge of what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
And just say a little more about the potential tension between those as you're trying to, move towards more growth and.
So I think the aim of energy, and any energy secretary will tell you they've got three aims. They have to make sure they can keep the lights on. They need to make sure that the energy is as cheap as possible so their people, their businesses can thrive. And they need to now make sure that we can achieve our climate change ambitions. So So whenever you're looking at anything to do with energy, you have to make sure that you can do all of those things. And that's as true if you're looking at renewables as it was when you were looking at purely oil and gas. So if you think about the past when you had a lot of pipeline politics and considerations, conversations with allies about where you would put certain infrastructure, those are the same conversations that we're having now when it comes to renewables if you think about critical minerals. Because you don't want to be in a position where Europe has weaned itself off Russian oil and gas for us to be dependent on China for all of our critical minerals, for example. So I don't think there is a new tension here. I think it's the same challenges that we face all along. When it comes to overall economic growth, there are huge opportunities, and that's what we're trying to maximise with our broader plans, which I'm sure we'll come on to.
You know, and I think that energy security really, I mean, it's been a recurrent thing, and as we were talking yesterday, it goes up and down, but it had really fallen off the table during COVID because energy was, you know, actually oil went to minus $37 a barrel, and there was no problem about supplies, and suddenly you have geopolitics intervene, you have Russia invading Ukraine, and suddenly even a German government where the Greens took the lead in doing something that they would not have thought was possible, which is having 5 LNG importing facilities. And this all happened very quickly. So it really was a wake-up call, or take Norway that suddenly worries about the security of pipelines and things that just weren't on the agenda. So I think what you've done by putting one department is kind of dealt with the reality we have now rather than the reality that was there a couple of years ago.
And just in terms of a little more detail for Secretary of State, just on the concerns that I know people will ask it here about not meeting the emission targets and so on, but the compromise, apparent compromise, which the priority on economic growth, some people fear might be cut. Just a little more on that.
So in terms of where we are in targets, we are sort of the poster child for major economies in decarbonisation. So not only have we decarbonised our economy faster than any of our international peers by 50% since 1990, if you look at our targets going forward, we are still way ahead of everybody else. So we're expecting to decarbonise by 68% when it comes to 2030. The EU is at 55% and recently voted against going to 57%. We were talking a bit about this yesterday. And the US is at 40%. So we've done a huge amount, and the changes that we made in September were for a very specific thing, and that was to protect people's household finances at a time when they were really struggling. So it meant that we were saying you're not going to have to spend thousands of pounds that you might not have, but we still retain our very ambitious climate changes. And actually some of the changes that we've made, I think, are helping people get there. For example, we've increased the financial incentive to heat your home with clean energy. And you can see that starting to come through in the numbers, that that's a more successful approach than trying to mandate people to do things, which is not the right choice for their family. And Daniel, you were talking about what we've seen in some other countries, where you're forcing people at a time of great difficulty to make those kind of choices. Actually, what you're seeing is a revolt against some of the climate change consensus that we've been lucky to have broadly in continental Europe. So I think it's really important to understand that overall the emissions targets haven't changed, but I do think it's important that we are protecting people and shielding households from the personal costs that they might face, and that is the only way that you're going to maintain what's going to be a program of work over decades. That's the only way you're going to maintain public support for it.
Right. Well, I think that if you, as you say, don't protect people, if you have crises, it's a setback. You get a reaction, and you look at some of the vote totals in some of the European countries right now, and it's very worrying.
And then you mentioned Ukraine and its impact on emerging energy markets. Describe that
I think,
more broadly in the light.
I think, you know, we used to have a global oil market. We had a global market until February 23rd of 2022. You know, the U.S. was importing 600,000 barrels a day of Russian oil product, and no one noticed because it actually kept costs down. Now we have a divided market. Russia has lost its most important market for oil. It has created this ghost fleet to carry oil to India, to carry it to China. Russian gas that used to go to Europe is now stranded. It's not going anywhere. Eventually they'll build a second pipeline to China, but it will take a time. And so what was a global, it's really in a sort of symbol, in a way, of the larger breakdown in globalization that what we've seen. And you know, the G7 countries put this price cap on Russian oil for two different objectives. One is to reduce Russian revenues at the same time, keep oil flowing to avoid a shortage, and it worked as long as oil prices were low. It's more difficult, and I think we're going to see a tightening of this price cap on oil. But it's a divided world, and it also means that Russia is, which used to be being integrated into Europe, is now basically an economic dependency of China.
Claire, just on the specific on the British dimension of the impact of Ukraine on energy, but just any thoughts from you on?
So we were in a slightly different place on supply because we get about 50% of our supply from our own domestic production, and we have very good LNG infrastructure. In the way that you were talking about Germany was building it up, we already had that in an existing way, and we've got very strong pipeline connection with Norway. So actually during the height of the crisis, we tripled our gas exports to Europe. And we also were exporting more electricity. So supply was good, but you could see our vulnerability to prices because we can't shield ourselves from the European market of prices. And so our response has been to make sure, as you've seen in recent weeks, we've made massive announcements, whether it's on the electricity grid, whether it's on the supply chain, setting new auction rounds for offshore wind, to make sure we can have more homegrown energy. And actually over time, if you think about our consumption of energy at the moment, 70% at the moment is oil and gas. By 2050, the Independent Climate Change Committee is saying that will go down to about 25% from the data that they published. So you will still need oil and gas, but it'll be much reduced. And that's the program of work that we're taking. So as you'll have seen, if we need oil and gas, we think it should come from here, but also big programs of work around nuclear, around renewables as well.
So let me add that one other change here is that how markets have been reconfigured, because Putin actually, I think Angela will talk tomorrow about all the miscalculations of Putin. One of them was that he could shut off the gas to Europe and shatter the coalition supporting Ukraine. It didn't work because of LNG, and I know it's a little controversial, it didn't work because of shale gas in the United States. 40% of Europe's LNG imports now come from the United States, and the U.S. was not exporting any LNG in 2016. I think the other thing to say about energy security, my favorite quote about energy security actually comes from Winston Churchill when he was converting the British Navy, the Royal Navy, from coal to oil, and he was attacked in Parliament for doing that and saying, instead of depending on Welsh coal, we're going to depend upon oil from Persia. And he said, safety in oil lies in variety and variety alone. In other words, to me, the fundamental principle of energy security is diversification. And as the Secretary of State has said, it's not only diversification of where your oil or your gas comes from, but it's the buildup of renewables, which further diversifies your energy supply.
And just on this era of geopolitical instability, and obviously I certainly grew up in an era where who the OPEC ministers were household names virtually. It'd be hard to achieve that now, but there's fears obviously that things might be going back in that direction, and I mean there are reassurances. Amos Hochstein, Biden's chief energy advisor, obviously said in the Financial Times a few weeks ago that he didn't think that oil would be weaponized in consequence of this Middle East war as it was after 1973, exactly 50 years ago. Just be grateful for your perspectives on that, because you know all the dramatic personas.
Well, initially, whenever there was upheaval in the Middle East, the price of oil went up, and people expected it to go up. Well, it went up a little bit when this war began, but it did not, and now it's actually about $6 a barrel cheaper than it was on October 6th. And so I'd say there are three reasons. One is, I think, the buildup of U.S. shale. I mean, the U.S. is now producing more oil than any country has ever produced in the history of the world. Canada, Brazil are going up. And so that's part of the diversification. Secondly, maybe it's going to change now, but the financial markets, are basically still focused on, is it going to just be a slowdown in the economy, or is it going to be a recession? And thirdly, I think it's that the exporters now, those major Gulf exporters, they're so thoroughly integrated into the world economy, they don't want oil to be politicized. The risk, of course, is if some kind of disruption happens for kinetic effects. In other words, something, there have been as of a couple of weeks ago, there had been 50 attacks on U.S. Forces in Syria and Iraq by militias. If there was a disruption of supply, that would be the risk, but so far it hasn't happened. And in terms of geopolitics, today the world's largest importer of oil is China. Half of its oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz. China and Iran close, so perhaps China message to Iran is don't disrupt supplies, and Iran's message, we hope, to its proxies is don't disrupt supplies.
Claire, just from a UK perspective, it's something which your predecessors
Yes, well,
a long time ago had to deal with, and
yes.
now once again it's on your high up in your interest.
And it's something that I monitor very carefully. I think when you're energy secretary, you become very obsessed with energy prices all around the world. So it's something we look at very closely. I talk about with my international counterparts, but as Daniel said, at the moment we haven't seen any sort of price movement which is outside of the normal range.
And just again picking up, you mentioning China. You talk about China in the new map, about integrating it into the WTO. Obviously, China policy has been widely debated in this country in the last few years. Just interested in your
in the U.S.
The consensus may be
in
different.
the U.S. it's sort of not widely debated anymore.
Yeah.
There's, the very few things that not unite Democrats and Republicans, but it is China, or rather concern about China. I testified a couple of weeks ago to the Senate Energy Committee about critical minerals, which we'll come back to, and every question ended up being about China. So, I came up with this idea of the WTO consensus to try and describe that period that's now over, in which the integration of China and the world economy, everybody was in globalization together, we're all doing well together, and somehow around 2015, 2016, maybe earlier or later, it started to become great power competition. And so we're in a very different period. We hope that the amity of that APEC conference in San Francisco continues, but this gets into a whole new set of complications about energy, including renewable energy.
Say a bit more about that.
Well, I think the Secretary of State is thinking about it, but it's the need for minerals as you move to wind, every electric car has about 2.5 times more copper than a conventional car. So as you move into this era, there's a much greater emphasis on minerals and the need for them, but it takes like 20 years to develop a mine. And currently, China has a predominant position in mining, and even more so in the processing. Solar panels, 80%, batteries for electric cars, 80%, processing of cobalt, lithium, all of them, you go down the list. And so here's where the net zero ambitions come together or collide with great power competition, and I know this is on your agenda.
Yes, and I think when you think through energy security in the past, that meant where would you place your pipelines, which countries were you looking at for those kinds of sources. But now we will have to think about, where are you going to get your batteries, where are you going to get your magnets, which are in all of our wind turbines. And as you say, it's not just the mining, it's also the processing and refining capabilities, the manufacturing capabilities. And this comes up increasingly in your work that you're doing with your allies. So we signed the Atlantic Declaration with the US, and actually I was speaking to Jennifer Granholm, my counterpart, the Energy Secretary, just this week. We were talking about critical minerals and are working with many different countries on this, because all of us are going to need to make sure that we can source enough critical minerals if we are going to meet our energy needs, not just for climate change emissions, but also for energy security. So that's something that we do a lot of work on. And actually, we have some potential here. We've got some lithium mining in Cornwall. Yes, so the British Infrastructure Bank has been supporting the Cornish lithium mining industry, but it's something that we will not be able to have complete domestic production of. We will need to work with partners and make sure we have that.
So how
security.
far along are these partnerships working so far?
So the steps that we've taken forward, I would say, are considerable if you think about where we were like a decade ago.
Yeah.
There's definitely a huge amount more in terms of collaboration, but it will take time because to build a processing factory, all of those things, it takes a certain amount of years. But there's definitely an intense focus, and you can see from us, whether it's the critical mineral strategy or even this weekend we launched our very first battery strategy to make sure that we can have enough supply here. And we've seen big deals with companies that we've been working on to make sure that we can have enough of what we need to provide for people's energy needs in the future.
Well, the shorthand I use is moving from an era of big oil to big shovels. You're going to need a lot of shovels. I mean, just the example, what we did is we looked at copper and said, okay, take the, say, EU goals or the Biden goals, and then sort of put that into technology and then say, how much copper do you need? And copper is the metal of electrification. And you say, well, production has to double by 2035, but wait, it takes 20 years to open a new mine. And yesterday, the Supreme Court of Panama just ordered the closing down of a copper mine. And you just say, how do you do it? So this is a kind of choke point for renewable energy on a scale that people want to achieve.
But I think there are two things happening. So one is how we can make sure we source enough critical minerals, but there's also a stream of innovation work of how do we create these products using less critical minerals as well.
Yeah, and I think that will be, innovation, technology is going to be the solutions. Yeah.
Can I just again, because there's some people with real interest in the geopolitics of all of this, just a few thoughts from you, Dan, on the risk that interstate competition turns energy security into a zero-sum game.
Well,
talk a bit, and that's reflected in your book, but where we we've moved on even from that very prescient summary.
I mean, we've seen a little tit for tat in terms of, chips not going to China, and China sort of putting constraints on some rare earths. So I think that's there, but I think it's really a subset of what happens to the overall relationship, and the kind of drive that you're describing for diversification is really critical. And there's always, innovation can surprise. It's just how quickly does it come, and how, now they're talking about sodium-ion batteries, what you can do, but it's hard to put a time frame on that. So there is a sense of risk there, I think.
And say a little more how it could harm international climate efforts, that interstate competition, just to give a...
Well, in terms of if it affects those supply chains that are being developed, is certainly one way it does. The other way is, you're off to COP 28 and tomorrow, I think, and the major emitters, who are they? They're the United States, they're China, they're India, and so you need collaboration on them on climate objectives.
And Claire, just again picking up on Dan, and just the theme of geopolitics is back, that zero-sum game, how that, in your view, impacts upon us specifically here in this country, but maybe more widely, Phil.
Well, one of the things that we've seen over the past year is the EU and the US increase the level of subsidies for technologies. And in some ways, I actually think this is quite a welcome thing for us, because it means that you have more countries spending more money, driving down green premiums, creating new technologies that we can all use. So what we're focused on is making sure that where we have competitive advantages, and we do not only through geology skills, but also a first mover, we're further ahead than lots of people in some of these things, that we are pressing ahead with those advantages, because not only is our moral duty, I think, of the UK to create technology that we can export to the rest of the world when it comes to climate change, because we have very high ambitions and also an amazing innovation ecosystem and the capital to spend, which other countries may not. But it also means that we'll be driving down the cost for consumers here when you have multiple people doing that across different things, because we won't be able to be the people who create every single thing. That's not how the world works. So actually, I think more players is generally a welcome thing. And actually, we will have a benefit not just for consumers, but from sharing technology.
So let me add a footnote to what the Secretary said. To say the U.S. has added subsidies is a understatement. The IRA is estimated about $370 billion. Some people think it'll be $1 trillion. That's the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's really meant to it has a couple purposes. One, going back to your question, one of it is to deal with the competition with China. Secondly, very much is a climate and accelerating these technologies. But I think that there's a headwind, at least in the United States, for any capital-intensive projects, including renewables, which is inflation and interest rates has been having an impact. And so we're seeing delays in the United States. There are big ambitions for offshore wind, but they're being put on hold. But I think you all are much more advanced in that.
So we had a new administrative strike price for our next auction round, and I think the benefit that we have here is because we have been in the offshore wind game for so long now. We started a contract for a different scheme in 2014. It's widely understood. We recently moved to annual auctions, so there's a predictability there. The way it's structured is actually very competition driven. So we set a price, people compete against that, which again I think has stimulated a reduction in costs over time, but also high quality businesses taking part in it. And we've made some changes recently, so we had to raise the strike price, which had been declining for years, but actually there has been global challenges around the price of commodities and, as you say, the cost of capital. And we've made broader changes, which I think are just beneficial for people who are in the energy infrastructure space when it comes to capital allowances and some of the changes we saw in the autumn statement when it comes to the electricity grid. But with those changes in place and as I said, the sort of market expertise and awareness that we have here, we've had a lot of positivity from people in this latest round, just from investors. I was at the Global Investment Summit talking to people on Monday, and I think actually we should be able to see a good result. But it is going to take some careful thought, I think, in how we respond to the technology becoming a mature technology in the future, whereas before it has been an emerging one, and that's exactly the work that we're doing.
Well, I think it's very interesting because, I mean, we think of this as offshore would be a global business. It turns out it's not. In the US, it's a very immature business, and the supply chains don't exist. And I suppose you'd say the UK and then maybe Germany has the most mature offshore. I mean, it's a well-established, and a lot of your electricity comes from wind. Yeah.
Yes. No, it's been a huge success story here. So in terms of offshore wind, we now have the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth largest offshore wind farms anywhere in the world, and it's also driving other parts of our agenda. So because we have so much offshore wind, it means that we can do a lot when it comes to something like hydrogen. And if you look at the conversations that we're having with partners, somewhere like Germany plans to import 25% of its energy mix as hydrogen, and they see us as a key exporter. Right. So the whole benefit, I think, of being able to be a first mover and also have a particular strength that you play to is clear in the offshore wind story that you have here.
And I see in the audience some, to use Churchillian terminology, some past, some former naval persons and some serving naval persons. So just last question from me before we turn it over to the audience, just the role of the transnational maritime infrastructure in all of this, how you see that.
Can you add a second sentence to that question?
Well, I was expecting you to fill in the gaps.
By what is, as opposed to international, what do you come on?
Transnational, international, whatever term of art you choose to employ.
Are you talking about tankers? Are you talking about undersea
and both, all of them.
Well, I think they're very important.
Yeah.
Is that what you're getting at?
We want you to assert it in greater detail.
Well, I'm just thinking about it. I think there's much greater focus on the security of undersea pipelines than existed before. I mean, in a sense, it's the security of everything. I mean, there was increasing concern about cybersecurity for energy infrastructure. Now there's increased focus on physical security, and a country like Norway is organizing itself very differently in that regard. There's a very large U.S. naval force now in the Persian Gulf that's there to protect tankers and so forth.
Claire.
Yes, I mean, I think all of that is right. And actually, it was interesting. I went to the electricity systems operator, the big control room where they balance all of our electricity last week. And the thing that struck me talking to people, and I think it's always amazing to go to a business where people have worked there for 20 years. I always think that's interesting because you can hear their sort of views and how things have changed over time. And the way we balance electricity has become enormously more complicated because you have your renewable energy coming in. We've got a lot more in terms of interconnectors now going into Europe. And actually there will be, I think, a lot of infrastructure that is subsea, which is really important that we protect. But it's also really important, I might say, that we protect our subsea specialisms, because it's the same technology that you might use on an oil rig that you'll use on offshore wind. And actually one of the things that we've heard from the communities that we've talked about, which is why we've set out plans to make sure that as we go from a transition of lots of oil and gas to less unabated oil and gas, that we keep those communities going and we keep those skill sets going, because we have an enormous advantage in the UK in the level of subsea specialisms that we have, underwater technology, and also in equipment, which is important to maintain so that we can actually achieve our offshore wind and other renewable ambitions.
So before we go to the audience, if that was your plan, there are two things I wanted to just be sure we talk about. One is just what you all are doing in nuclear, speaking about balancing the load.
Yeah. Yes, so we have had a revival of nuclear here. So we've set up a company, Great British Nuclear. We're pressing ahead with new gigawatt projects, but we're also pressing ahead with small modular reactors, of which there's a handful of countries in the world, I think, who are able to do it, and we have a competition here, and it's one of the most advanced. We're hoping to get to a final project, I think in the next 10 years is the timeline, but that will still be very early compared to other countries. And the benefit of that is that you have cheaper projects, smaller projects, so it's easier to replicate them. And alongside that, you've got another stream of nuclear, which is very interesting to us in terms of advanced modular reactors, which we're looking at carefully, because when you think about fuel capabilities, again, that's somewhere that the UK has a strong competitive advantage.
Right. So the one thing I just wanted to also mention, and it's, I think, reflected in the title of your department, is that the ideas about energy transition themselves are going through a transition. Because you think about kind of what was there in 2021 when a famous scenario was done about getting to net zero, and it made it seem all rather easy. Then you had the war in Ukraine, you had price shocks, you had disruptions of supply chains for energy, general disruptions. You had now a second war. You had inflation, high interest rates. Going back to what we were talking about before, an accentuation of the great power rivalry. And it just, you go down the list and you just say, actually these things are more complicated. It's not easy to transform a $105 trillion world economy. It really is hard work. And that's why I was actually fascinated by the title of your department, because I think that reflects the reality of where we are as opposed to where thinking was a couple of years ago. And I think it's a tough process of thinking that has to kind of catch up with reality.
Thank you. Usual. So turn it over to the audience now. Usual house rule. No question too outrageous. You just have to state your name and organisation.
Well, let's not have them too outrageous.
We don't. I think we need a bit of spice here. Gentlemen in the front row, if you could wait till the microphone comes, please. Name and organisation, please.
Is this working?
Yes, we hear you.
So sorry, Jonathan Leake. I'm the energy editor at the Daily Telegraph, and I just wanted to challenge you a little, Claire, on the energy security aspect. So when it comes to gas from the North Sea, I think you're completely right. We pretty much use all that we produce in the UK. And that gas comes mainly from the southern North Sea and Morecambe Bay. But when it comes to oil, it's a bit more dubious. So we produce something like, I think, 40 million tonnes of oil a year, and about 20% of that goes straight to China. CNOOC is operating in the North Sea and may take a lot of our crude as it is without any refining here straight to China. She could say, in that sense, it's undermining our security. And much of the rest, effectively a total of 80%, goes immediately abroad. It goes, I think, largely to Holland, but to a number of other places. And the third point is that is going to increase because we've just lost a refinery. We've lost Grangemouth. And our other 5 refineries, which are all that's left out of about 16 from maybe 15 years ago, are pretty shaky as well, at least some of them. So it's very hard to argue a case for energy security.
What's your question?
Exactly
I
this.
think he's asked it.
I think the question is, how can drilling for more oil, when pretty much all of it will be exported,
Well,
really support our energy security?
Before she answers that, let her think for a moment. Let me add a dimension to it. One of the biggest oil exporters in the world today is the United States, and one of the biggest markets for U.S. oil is China. And so at least the way I look at it, sort of student of the market, it's the net balance that matters rather than the specific barrels. It's the overall supply system. So that would be just, I wanted to get that on the table and give.
Yeah, so I would say two things. Firstly, I mean, you're right when it comes to gas. About 50% of our supply is domestically produced. So that is incredibly important in terms of straight line energy security. In terms of oil, we're a net importer of oil. So yes, it's refined often in Europe, but then we import it back. So it is also important that for European security, which we also care about, that I think we're a producer. But the most important thing is that not only does it help us raise billions of pounds of tax revenue, which we can spend on transitioning energy at the pace of change that no one has ever seen before, but also we can make sure that we attract business investment into the things that we need. For example, carbon capture, hydrogen, and offshore wind. So I do think it's incredibly important that even as we reach net zero, we're very hard-headed about what that means, and we're very logical about it. And someone like the Independent Climate Change Committee will say that we'll still need oil and gas for 25% of our energy mix. So whether you're thinking about emissions and importing gas from abroad, as I'm sure you know, has 4 times higher emissions, or whether you're thinking about how do we make that transition as fast as possible, well, we're going to need money to spend from private businesses, but also from the public side as well. I think it makes no sense to say we'll shut this down too soon and send those jobs abroad, when actually we could be using the same skills, people and community in a managed way to help us make the energy transition that we all want to make.
Gentleman there in the middle, in the aisle, just there on the right. Name and organisation, please.
Eric Coleman from Seagull Projects. We're a not-for-profit research company looking at net zero. I spent 2 years studying net zero with Lord Howell, who I think you know, and Imperial College in London. Our research suggests that this government, who I've been a supporter of for 40 years, I have to say, are not making progress on net zero in the way they should be. We've produced a report to that effect, and if it's possible, I'd like to give you a copy before you leave.
Is that the question?
That's
a great question.
Will
you accept the copy?
Well,
Your staff will accept it.
I wouldn't want to debate the net zero progress here and now, but our research suggests the government is making woefully inadequate progress genuinely on net zero, and I've got a report that I think would be of interest to you.
Well, look, I'm happy. I'll look at the report. I'll read anything that you know people want to give to me. But let me just say this: there is no one out of any of our international peers who have decarbonised their economy faster than the UK. If you look at our plans going forward, even the UN had a report last week saying we are going to make some of the most progress in the G20 between 2025 and 2030. And in terms of our targets, as I said before, we're decarbonising by 68%, the EU is at 55%, and the US is at 40%. So I also think we need to look at that international comparison and celebrate some of the good work that lots of people have worked very hard to do, whilst also challenging ourselves to move forward. And even if you think about the announcements that we've made in the recent weeks, so whether it's the electricity grid, which is going to be incredibly important, whether it's supply chain around clean energy, whether it's the transition that we've made on heat pumps to a financial incentive model, which we can see is working through the early numbers that we've got in, we are only making progress in this area. So I would say if you give me your report, you should also read some of mine.
If we can have, who else do I see wants to ask a question? I'm sure there are many. Lady at the front, please. Name and organisation, please.
Hello.
A question, please.
Yes, it's a question. Amanda and Leslie Friedman with IP3 Corporation. We are nuclear energy and national security, an American company. Question on GBN, which we applaud the setting up of Great British Nuclear, and your department. Are you behind the scenes working together to really streamline the advancement of the small modular reactor programs with special attention, I suppose, paid to Rolls-Royce as the national reactor, so that we can accelerate the timelines and hopefully move them left of 10 years, given the needs and the reactors that will be decommissioned.
So I was with GBN today. I want to move at pace. We all want to move at pace. I think it is right to have a competition, because we've seen the challenges in various projects I've seen over the years when you don't have enough people competing. We think that's a good principle to have, to make sure you can have as low cost projects as possible in the future, and also drive innovation. But once we finish the small modular reactor competition, it'll be the fastest competition of its kind anywhere in the world, and it's something that I'm very focused on.
So I'd like to revert to the net zero question, because Europe, US, but if you look at, you take China, Indonesia, India, Nigeria, and Russia, they're 45% of emissions. None of them have net zero by 2050 targets. It's either 2060 or 2070. And so I sometimes think, I mean, what Britain's doing, what the United States is doing, what Europe's doing is very important, but we need to keep in mind the overall scale of it, and that 80% of the people in the world live in, whether you want to call it the global south, which I was reading today somewhere is the term we shouldn't use, or emerging markets, whatever you call it, and that's where energy demand's growing. And last year, oil overtook coal as the world's #1 energy source in the 1960s. Last year, the world used more coal than it's ever used before, 3 times as much as the 1960s. So I think it's important to keep a global focus on this, as well as, individual countries, if you look at the scale of things.
Great. Who else do I see? I'm trying to, I'm blinded by the light, so it enforces impartiality on me and who I ask questions for. So please, that's my excuse. Don't blame me if I omit you. Just see somebody in the middle there towards the back. Yeah. Name and organization, please.
I'm Tomohiro Ebuchi from Nikkei News, Japanese media. Thank you very much. The question is to the secretary. As you mentioned, the UK government has increased the maximum price for offshore wind in the contracts for different auction from £44 to £73. This increase will cost the public. On the other hand, the UK government delayed the ban on the sale of petrol cars in order to lighten the cost of the public. These seem to be opposite directions. Could you explain a little? And also, how attractive do you think £73 is for offshore wind operators?
So
Thank you.
I think that's 3 questions.
So a few things there. Firstly, we do think that's cheap compared to other energy. I'm updating the levelized cost of energy, which looks at all different technologies in the department, so that we've got robust methodology around this, but we do think that is cheap comparatively. If you think about how electricity prices are generated, obviously it takes into account different sources. So the other point of your question was, I'm sorry, I lost track. What was the second part?
EVs.
Oh, so what we did on EVs, yes. So in terms of what we've done on EVs, yes, we and the other moves that we made, yes, we want to make sure that people don't have to spend thousands of pounds on their insulation, for example. We made changes there, and their boilers, and that people have a bit more time to choose when it comes to cars. That actually takes us in line with pretty much all of our international peers. It's something that we were talking about yesterday. Yes. It's pretty much virtually where everyone is. And at the same time, we're also, as you'll have seen, doing supportive things with the EV industry, and the battery strategy that we set out at the weekend obviously will be incredibly helpful in that respect. So these things I think do work perfectly together. Yes, we need enough electricity supply. Yes, we're working very hard to make sure that we have that, and we have that at the best possible cost across different technologies. But when it comes to the consumer, we want to give people as much space as possible to make their own choices, whilst as government giving them a helping hand where we can. And that's exactly the model that we've taken. If you think about the boiler upgrade scheme, which we've now made the most generous in Europe, the work that we're doing on charge points to make sure that people find it attractive to have an electric vehicle, helping where we can, but also we want it to be a positive choice for people.
So I see a load more questions. See somebody, I'm just practicing geographical diversity. I can see a gentleman there, I think, by the wall.
I'm not a gentleman.
Sorry, forgive me. I can't. This is the trouble. I can't see who it is.
No problem. That's the second time that's happened to me in a month. Maybe I need to change my hair or something. So I have two related questions. The first one is about. Oh, sorry. I'm Catherine Porter. I'm an independent energy consultant. My business is called What Logic. The first one's about offshore wind. We've been subsidising offshore wind now for a quarter of a century. So I think this technology now, if it's not mature, we should be asking some hard questions about why not. We saw turbine manufacturers starting to lose billions of euros since 2019, so before COVID and before Ukraine. We see this as a technology that still earns income based on the price of gas, which is far and above the short-run marginal cost of generating electricity from wind. And so my question is, why are we still subsidizing this industry? And my second question is, you just mentioned you're going to be updating the levelized cost of energy across all the generation methods. Is that going to be a fully cost comparative, including the full cost to the consumer? So balancing costs, energy reserve costs, extra grid infrastructure costs, and if you really want to make it fully comparative, then decommissioning costs as well.
I think those questions are directed to you.
That must be a really hot question.
So first on the LCOE, we have an enhanced LCOE at the moment which includes some of those things. It's work that we're doing at the moment, but I do want it to be as robust as possible so we can make these comparisons. Secondly, if you look at the administered strike price on offshore wind and where it is now, it's 4 times lower than gas was at the height of the crisis. So I think if you think about going forward and the volatility of markets, it is important that we have homegrown energy. And as I said, we do think it's comparatively still cheap compared to the rest of the market. So in terms of why we stimulate our own industry, it's those two things. We need to have enough energy going forward. We need to make sure that it's clean. We want it to be homegrown, and actually the costs in the offshore wind market have dramatically come down, partly because we've taken a market solution approach which was allowing them to compete. So I would say actually it's a success story for the UK overall.
Very good. Thank you. My apologies again for misrecognising anyone. Gentleman there, I think, if it is a gentleman by the pillar.
Marshall Hall from the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. What role do you expect carbon capture and storage to play in UK energy transition? And perhaps for Dr. Yergin, what role might it play more widely internationally?
Sure.
Do you want me to start?
Okay, I'll start. Well, I think as the IPCC, the UN says, I mean, it has to play a role because to get the numbers to work. You know, I mean, it's still, talk about a nascent business, that's really a nascent business. I think I was very struck that, you know, when people first talked about direct air capture, it was kind of thought to be highly speculative. But then the other day we saw that BlackRock, which is a pretty hard-headed investor, is putting $500 million into direct air capture. So, but I think it's still, you know, I mean, certainly the IRA, the US legislation, is encouraging it. So I think it's still early days and still much to be learned about it. But I think it's going to be part of the mix in order to achieve the kind of goals that are out there.
Yes, exactly. So we are pushing very hard to reduce the use of unabated fossil fuels around the world, but abated fossil fuels will still be part of the mix, I think, particularly for industry. So we've made big bets on carbon capture, not least because we have a very interesting geological competitive advantage in the intercontinental shelf, which other countries don't have, which is a very good storage potential when it comes to carbon. So we've set out £20 billion that we're putting behind it. You know, the work that's being done now is the innovation by companies. We're doing the sort of frameworks, looking at regulation around storage, transport, those kind of things, trying to create clusters where this technology can work. But absolutely, we think that this could be a really important part of the mix to make sure that people can reduce emissions, maintain their industries, and also store their carbon, hopefully for us a great export potential.
So, you know, it's CCS, carbon capture and storage. There's also CCUS, which is carbon capture, use and storage. And I think that's an area where I see increasing activity to say, how do we use this carbon and turn it into something useful?
No, there's not very much. So I'd like to take as many remaining questions as possible in a clutch, as it were. Gentleman at the back, please, first question, and then we'll just get 3 people to ask.
Hi, Bradley. I'm from Madano. We're a communications consultancy that focuses on the net zero transition. There was an interesting piece in the FT this morning reporting that the government is not going to go ahead with proposals to separate the price of gas and electricity. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your thinking on that issue, and also onto the topic of REMA more broadly. How would you reassure businesses that are worried that the REMA programme, particularly locational marginal pricing, will interfere with their existing business case for renewable energy assets?
Good, thanks. I just asked the 2 other, just I see there's number. Gentleman there in the middle. There's a gentleman there in the middle, just by the lady. Yep, just along there. Name and organisation, please. Yeah, you.
Sorry, there are 2 of us right next to each other. Tobias Burke, Stonehaven. It's a strategic political consultancy focused on sustainability and decarbonisation. You mentioned a few times during the talk this evening the critical mineral strategy, as well as the new battery strategy that the UK has come out with. Having spoken to a few people in the industry, I think that there's a consensus that it identifies a lot of the challenges that the UK faces correctly, and many of the factors that need to be addressed. But as was also said earlier this evening, the IRA and other measures taken by major economies worldwide to subsidise their battery supply chains are enormous compared to the UK. The Treasury is extremely stretched at the moment. So what is essentially the real clinch type of policy direction that the UK is going to take to actually scale up its battery supply chain? Is it about regulation? Is it about smart legislation? Because it seems that we're not going to be able to match our international competitors like the United States. So what's the game?
And behind you, directly behind. Name and organisation, please.
Hello, Paddy McGuinness from C5 Capital, amongst other things. I wanted to ask you about the nuclear supply chain. We tend to gloss over it and have great ambitions, and the US is talking about tripling its ambitions for growth, particularly in the SMR area. And I'm struck that for fuel, we're heavily dependent still on Russian-enriched uranium. And I wonder what the route out of that is, given the glacial pace of change in the nuclear supply.
Can I
please
take a couple of the questions? What is it? Something like 45% of uranium is mined in Kazakhstan, and something like around the same proportion is processed and enriched in Russia. And kind of no one paid any attention to this. Alarm bells have gone off, and for the first time, the U.S. has recommissioned a new enrichment facility that had been dormant for 20 or 30 years. So there is a vulnerability in the supply chains on nuclear. Also, people is an issue. I think, there was not a great incentive when it looked like all, nuclear was flat or going down for people to go into nuclear engineering. So there's a human supply chain. Submarines have been an important source of that talent. So I think that uranium, I don't think is classified as a critical mineral, but uranium is really critical, and I think, attention is on it, and people were, again, just not paying attention to how much dependent on Russia. And what I want to say about the supply chains on batteries and critical minerals, that's why things like the Mineral Security Partnership, that it isn't just Japan doing something, it's not just the United States doing something, it's not just Britain or Europe doing something, it's kind of all of these countries collaborating together to create a new set of supply chains that ties together, that just brings more balance and security to the system. So I don't think any single industrial country, G7 or leading country, can do it by itself. It has to be together. And right now the US government is trying to define systems to create quasi-free trade agreements with countries like Japan and others that would allow them to be collaborative. So I think it has to be looked at as on a collaborative basis rather than a single basis. But
yes, so if I find the whole area of nuclear fuel really interesting, I think there is a role for the UK to play because we have some specialities, things that we're very good at. I think HALEU is a particularly interesting space for us. In terms of REMA, we're looking at the retail electricity market as as we speak, I've been going through lots of different things. I think it's a really interesting space so that we can make sure that consumers are getting a fair price, but also that we have an electricity market that fits the electricity generation that we're going to have in the future, and you'll see more in this space shortly. In terms of how we compete, I think firstly we are strategic, we play to our competitive advantages. You actually have seen some battery manufacturers vote with their feet to start presences in the UK recently. If you think that the only way that countries compete is just straight subsidy, then the UK would never have flourished at all. We've never competed in that way. So we do smart subsidy. We also are very good at doing ambitious agile regulatory frameworks. We have deep capital markets. We have a great innovation ecosystem. We have skills. We have expertise. We have lots of things which make the country competitive, which is why we've always been so. Yes, that takes work. We need to maintain that, but there's also an enormous amount of work going on to do that.
Great. Dan, final verdict.
I think you're the moderator.
Good, no, you. But people have come to hear you, so that's why we want to squeeze the last bit of value out of you.
Well, as I think about it, it's energy systems are complex. They don't change overnight. And a lot of different things have to play into it. And I think what you've been talking about, the skill set, it's, ultimately the answer is going to be in technology and innovation and getting markets to support that kind of innovation. But I think there's a recognition, questions have been asked, but it's going to be more challenging. And I think have to see it on a global basis in terms of emissions and the overall targets.
Brilliant, thank you. So all that remains for me now is to call upon Lord Robertson of Port Ellen, former Secretary General of NATO, Secretary of State for Defence, who has kept a great eye on this debate for many years, to deliver our vote of thanks. George.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you to both our speakers. I think we've had a master class here this evening from both the great guru of the subject and the new and very impressive minister, I have to say, as somebody from the opposition.
What a high
compliment! I know we've got to grown up in the job, and I think as a patriotic member of British society, I'm reassured by that as well. Two small anecdotes. Last Friday, I addressed the Dunblane and Bridge of Allen Rotary Club's 50th anniversary dinner. I used to address international summits. But I look back the 50 years to 1973 when the Rotary Club was formed, and it's an interesting year because we had a war in Israel and we had an oil price shock at that time. So things come round to exactly the same thing. The second anecdote is that when I became Secretary of State for Defence, I remember going to a meeting, being briefed about our submarine force. And I asked a question about undersea pipelines. And there was a sort of shocked silence in the room. And eventually somebody said, well, Secretary of State, we can't answer that question because not everybody in this room is at the same level of clearance. We'll tell you later on. And now the subject of pipelines is there in public and open and big and serious. And I think in terms of energy supply, it's one of the key issues that is confronting us today. And it's very public and it's well known, and we need to bear that in mind. Leon Trotsky, who I'm not prone to quoting, once said, you may not be interested in this war, but this war is interested in you. And the subject of energy security, you might not be interested in it, but it is certainly interested in the rest of us as well. And I think this evening we've heard just the tip of that iceberg about how important the whole question about the transition is to net zero, and this whole question about energy supply, the vulnerabilities now of us to the electro-states as distinct from the petro-states, those with the the minerals that are going to be required for the new age that we are heading towards. So the subject of tonight is a big one, as the quality and quantity of this audience, I think, amply shows. We have been educated well this evening, impressed from what we've heard, and I ask the audience to give a vote of thanks to our speakers.
Thank you all. Not really are you free to go, you're encouraged to go, because we've got to set the room up for another event. But thank you all for coming.